This session will be discussing about the anatomy of the brain. Everybody will be knowing brain. It's situated at the cranial cavity. So brain, it's having there are two cerebral hemispheres, and there are two cerebellar hemisphere and a brainstem. So brain is having three parts: cerebrum, cerebellum, and the brainstem. Cerebrum is divided into two hemispheres. Cerebellum again divided into two hemispheres, and brainstem, it is divided into three parts. These are midbrain, pons, and medulla. Now the medulla is the lower part of the brainstem. It is continuous with the spinal cord by passing through the foramen magnum. So brain is having three parts: cerebrum, cerebellum, and the brainstem. Brainstem again divided into midbrain, pons, and medulla. Now cerebrum. Cerebrum is divided into two hemispheres, and two hemispheres are connected by a tissue called corpus callosum. Then cerebrum is having three poles: a frontal pole, a temporal pole, and an occipital pole. Now it's having two sulcus called a central sulcus and the lateral sulcus, which divide the cerebrum into a frontal area, a parietal area, a temporal area, and an occipital area. So by two sulcus, central sulcus and lateral sulcus, divide the cerebrum into frontal area, parietal area, temporal area, and occipital area. Now the central sulcus lies between frontal and parietal lobe, and the lateral sulcus lies between frontal and parietal lobe upward and temporal lobe downwards. The posterior most lobe is called occipital lobe. Now brainstem is having three different parts: midbrain, pons, and medulla. Medulla is the lower part of the brainstem, extending from the lower border of the pons just above the first cranial nerve and continues as the spinal cord. So at the junction of the spinal cord and the medulla, and the medulla, this is the position of the starting of the first cranial nerve. Now the medulla extends down through the foramen magnum as spinal cord. Now the medulla is divided into right and left halves by anterior and posterior median fissure, and each half is further divided into anterior, lateral, posterior region, and anterior, lateral, and posterior region by anterolateral sulcus and posterolateral sulcus. The anterior region is in the form of long elevation. There are long elevation called pyramids. Pyramids is an important part of the cortico-spinal tract or pyramidal tract. The lower part of the medulla, right and left, in the lower part of the medulla, right and left pyramidal fibers crosses in the midline, forming a pyramidal decussation. So lower part, there is pyramids are there, and pyramidal fibers are there. Fibers of the cortico-spinal tracts are there. So in the lower part of the medulla, these fibers cross and form the pyramidal decussation. Then upper part of the left region shows an oval elevation called olive. Olive contain inferior olivary nucleus. Then rootlets of the hypoglossal nerve originate from the anterolateral sulcus between the pyramid and olive. The rootlet of the 9th and 10th and the cranial part of the accessory nerve emerge from behind the olive. So this hypoglossal nerve and the rootlets of the hypoglossal nerve between pyramid and olive, and 9th, 10th, and accessory cranial part of the accessory nerve from behind the olive. Posterolateral region lies between the posterolateral sulcus and posteromedial fissure. Next part is the pons. Pons is the middle part of the brainstem, that is between the midbrain and medulla. It's having two surfaces, a ventral or anterior surface and a posterior surface. Ventral surface is convex with a vertical basilar sulcus which lodges the basilar artery. There is a basilar sulcus and where the basilar artery is situated. Lateral surface is continuous with the middle and cerebellar peduncle. Lateral surface is continuous with the middle cerebellar peduncle, and trigeminal nerve is attached to the surface at the junction of pons and middle cerebellar peduncle. Abducens nerve, facial nerve, vestibulocochlear nerve are attached in the lower border of the anterior surface of the pons. So 6th, 7th and 8th nerve are attached at the lower border of the anterior surface. Now, pons contains several pontine nuclei which forms an important part of the cortico-pondocerebellar pathway. Pons contain corticospinal and corticonuclear tract also. Now, unilateral lesion of the lower part of the pons result in paralysis of the facial nerve on the side of the lesion and paralysis of the limbs on the opposite side of the lesion. That is, if there is unilateral paralysis of the pons on the lower part of the pons, there is paralysis of the facial nerve on the side of the lesion and paralysis of the limb on the opposite side of the lesion. This condition is called crossed hemiplegia. It is also called Millard-Gubler syndrome. So, crossed hemiplegia means it is the paralysis of the limb on the paralysis on the limb on the opposite side and paralysis of the face on one side and paralysis of the limb on the opposite side. It is due to the unilateral lesion of the lower part of the limb. It is due to the unilateral lesion in the lower part of the pons. It is also called Millard-Gubler syndrome. Next is the midbrain. It is also called mesencephalon. It connects the third and fourth ventricle, and it is the transverse section of the midbrain shows two parts, an anterior part and the posterior part. Next important structure in the brain is the cerebellum. Cerebellum is situated on the posterior cranial fossa behind the pons and medulla. It is having two cerebellar hemisphere. It is having two hemisphere like cerebrum. The cerebellum is also having two hemisphere connected through a median vermis. So, central vermis is the connection between two hemispheres. Again, each hemisphere is divided into three lobes, that is, an anterior lobe, a middle lobe, and a small foculonodular lobe. So, cerebellum, like cerebrum, it is having two hemispheres, and these two hemispheres connected by a vermis. And it is each hemisphere again divided into three lobes, that is, anterior lobe, middle lobe, and there is foculonodular lobe, which is the smallest lobe. And this cerebellum is situated in the posterior cranial fossa behind the pons and medulla. Now, the anterior and there are three lobes are there. First of all, the anterior and middle lobe is separated by a primary fissure, and middle and foculonodular lobe is separated by posterolateral fissure. And we already discussed that there is a vermis which connect between two cerebellar hemisphere. Vermis can be divided into different parts. There are different parts in the vermis. These are lingula, central lobule, culmen, declive, folium, tuber, uvula, and nodule. These are the different parts of the vermis. So, these are lingula, central lobule, culmen, declive, folium, tuber, pyramid, uvula, and nodules are the different parts of the vermis. Now, functionally, we can divide the cerebellum into three. These are archicerebellum, that is, functionally we can divide the cerebellum into three. These are archicerebellum, paleocerebellum, and neocerebellum. Now, what are the functions of the cerebellum? First of all, its main function is it influence on voluntary activity. So, for a goal-oriented smooth execution of voluntary activity, the cerebellum, an intact cerebellum is necessary. That is, once we get a stimulation, once we get a impulse, then the body starts reacting, and the cerebellum is the structure which monitor the reaction, and if needed, the readjustment can be done, and it is done by the cerebellum. And second function is the maintenance of tone, posture, and equilibrium. These are the main two functions of the cerebellum. The first one is influence on voluntary activity. The second one is the maintenance of tone, posture, and equilibrium. Now, see if any lesions in the cerebellum occurs. This condition is called Cerebellar Syndrome. The causes may be a thrombosis of the feeding artery or a tumor either in the cerebellum or a cerebellopontine angle or any injury. This may cause damage to the cerebellum. So, once it is damaged, once there is a damage to the cerebellum, it affects its function also. We already discussed what are the functions of cerebellum, and a thrombosis of the feeding artery or a tumor or an injury causes damage to the cerebellum. Now, which are the signs and symptoms once there is a lesions to the cerebellum or injury to the cerebellum? The first thing is ataxia, and there will be disturbance in the voluntary movements. The next sign is that there will be dysmetria, that is, fails to attain the exact degree of contraction of the muscles. That is, there may be pause pointing. So, for example, while reaching for a glass of water, hands stop in the midway, or we overshoot the object. This is called dysmetria. That we are not able to, the person is not able to exactly find out how much distance it is. So, exact point we cannot. And while reaching a glass of water, hand stops in the midway or overshoot the object. So, dysmetria, it is also called pause pointing. Next sign is that there is an indention tremor. That is, no tremor at the rest. Once you start doing work, there will be tremor. This is called indention tremor. That is, there is no tremor at rest, and once you are doing some work or something, then there will be tremor. This is called indention tremor, and indention tremor is just opposite to the tremor which is seen in the Parkinsonism. In the Parkinsonism, the type of tremor is the resting tremor. So, in case of cerebellar syndrome, there is cerebellar syndrome, there is indention tremor, but in case of Parkinsonism, it is resting tremor. Next is dysarthria. Dysarthria means that is effect in articulation, various types of affecting articulation. So, the effects are, the type of speech is called the scanning speech. So, the person will stop while between the speech, there will be breaks and there will be loud noise. The speech may be slurred speech, explosive type of speech. He must stop in between the speech, and the sound, the voice may be more. So, this is called dysarthria. This type of speech is called scanning speech or dysarthria. Then the next sign is the nystagmus. It is especially due to the ataxia to the ocular muscle. Nystagmus means there is rhythmic oscillation movements of the eyes. So, this is called nystagmus. It is due to ataxia of the ocular muscle. Next signs and symptom is dysdiadokinesia, that is inability to perform rapid alternative motion. For example, he won't be able to perform rapid pronation and supination movement. This is called dysdiadokinesia. The person won't be able to perform the rapid alternative motions like pronation and supination. Then varying degree of hypotonia may be there, like tendon jerk, pendular tendon jerk may be there. Now, the equilibrium may be severely affected. That is, the gait type, the gait will be affected. As the equilibrium is affected, the walking way, the gait will be affected. The name of the gait is staggering gait or a drunken gait. The way the person walking is called here, the drunken gait or staggering gait will be there in case of cerebellar syndrome. Now the posture. The posture will be like the tilting head towards the side of the lesion. So the signs will go through the signs and symptoms of the cerebellar syndrome again. The first one is the ataxia. Second one is the disturbance in the voluntary movements. Then dysmetria, that is sparse pointing, that person fails to attain the exact degree of contraction. That is, while reaching a glass of water, he stops in the midway. Then there may be there may be indention tremor, that is not tremor at the rest. While doing activity, there will be a tremor. Next is dysarthria, type of speech will be a scanning speech. Next one is nystagmus, that is sudden movements, sudden rhythmic oscillation of the eye. So it is due to the ataxia of oscillatory muscle, ocular muscle, the ataxia of ocular muscle. Then next one is dysdiadokinesia, that is he won't be able to perform the rapid alternative motion like pronation and supination. Then varying degree of hypotonia, like tendon jerk may be pendular type of tendon jerk. Then there will be staggering gait or drunken gait will be there, and the posture will be like tilting the head towards the side of the lesion. Now, how will you check the cerebellar function? So we can check, the first important thing is the coordination. We can check the finger nose. We can go for test for coordination is finger nose coordination, finger nose test. That we are asking the subject to touch his own nose and the examiner's finger. This is called a finger nose test. A person with cerebellar dysfunction won't be able to do this function, able to do this test. Next one is pronation and supination test. That is, the person with cerebellar dysfunction, there will be dysdiadokinesia and person cannot perform rapid pronation and supination. Then we are asking the tone and posture and equilibrium will get affected. So the person cannot walk in a straight line. We ask the subject to walk in a straight line. The person cannot walk. So this is the another test. We are asking the person to walk in a straight line. Then if the person is bedridden, we can go for a heel shin test. That is for bedridden person. That is, heel shin test can be done for in case of bedridden person. That is, we are asking the subject to move his heel towards the shin and again back in rapid motion. Now, so we can test the cerebellar function by using these tests: finger nose test, pronation supination test, walk in a straight line test, and heel shin test, especially in case of bedridden patients. Now, diencephalon. Diencephalon is the midline structure which is largely embedded in the cerebrum, and as it is embedded inside, it is hidden from the surface view. Now, diencephalon is having two parts, a dorsal part and a ventral part. Dorsal part consists of thalamus, metathalamus, and epithalamus. Dorsal part is having three parts again, that is thalamus, metathalamus, and epithalamus. The ventral part consists of subthalamus and hypothalamus. So diencephalon can be divided into two parts, a dorsal part and a ventral part. The dorsal part consists of thalamus, metathalamus, epithalamus, ventral part, subthalamus, and hypothalamus. Now we will be discussing about thalamus. Thalamus is a major station. It's a station where all impulses is transferred. It is all impulses relay through the thalamus. That is, it's a major station where all specific sensory impulses, except smell, relay before terminating into the cerebral cortex. Now, so even the cerebral cortex is damaged. Crude sensory perception, for example, like pain, remains present because thalamus acts as a crude center for sense of perception. So thalamus is a relay station, or it's a station where all the sensory impulses are transferred to the cerebral cortex. So even it acts as a crude center for especially the impulses like crude impulses like pain, because in case of even when the cerebral cortex is damaged, crude perception can remain intact because of the presence of thalamus. So thalamus's main function is it's a relay station between outside and the cerebral cortex. Now, almost majority of the ascending impulses, non-specific ascending impulses from reticular activating system relay through the thalamus, through the thalamic nucleus, especially through the thalamic nuclei before it reaches to the cerebral cortex. And it's having intimate connection with the frontal cortex and hypothalamus. Thalamus is also involved in the feeling of personality and different emotions. So it's having connection with the hypothalamus and it's associated with the frontal cortex also. So it's having a role in the subjective feeling of personality and various other emotions. Next part is the hypothalamus. Now, thalamus and hypothalamus together we can call it as diencephalon. It lies at the lateral wall of the third ventricle. Now, it can be considered as a head ganglion of the autonomic nervous system because it takes part in the control of many visceral and metabolic activities of the body. So, hypothalamus we can call it as a head ganglion or head of autonomic nervous system because it's having lots of visceral and metabolic functions. We'll go through what are its different functions of hypothalamus. So, different functions of hypothalamus. The first thing is that the most important function of hypothalamus is the endocrine control. It produces lots of inhibiting and releasing hormones, and by forming this releasing the releasing and inhibiting hormone, it regulates the anterior pituitary, especially it produces inhibiting and releasing hormone which control the endocrine functions of anterior pituitary. So this hormone, it produces releasing and inhibiting hormone. The releasing hormones are GHRH, that is growth hormone releasing hormone, TRH, that is thyrotropin releasing hormone, and GRH, gonadotropin releasing hormone. So it produces this endocrine control. It produces three types of hormones, three types of releasing hormones, that is growth hormone releasing hormone, thyrotropin releasing hormone, and gonadotropin releasing hormone. It produces two inhibitory hormones also. So these are somatostatin, that is growth hormone inhibiting hormone, and prolactin inhibiting hormone. So through this releasing and inhibiting hormone, this hypothalamus controls the anterior pituitary. So growth hormone releasing hormone, thyrotropin releasing hormone, gonadotropin releasing hormone, growth hormone inhibiting hormone, and prolactin inhibiting hormone are the hormones which releasing and inhibiting hormone or controlling hormones which is produced by hypothalamus. Now, instead of this, the other functions are it's having other endocrine functions like it can produce hormones also. The first one is it's having a function of neurosecretion. So it produces oxytocin and vasopressin. These are the main hormones which is produced by hypothalamus. And after producing this oxytocin and vasopressin, it is released. It is transported to the posterior pituitary, and posterior pituitary it acts as only as a storage organ. So hypothalamus produces the oxytocin and vasopressin, and it is stored in the posterior pituitary. Now, hypothalamus is having functions on the ANS, that is autonomic nervous system. That is, especially the anterior part of the hypothalamus, it mediates the sympathetic activity. So hypothalamus controls the autonomic nervous system. So it can control the cardiovascular system, it can control the respiratory system, and it can control the elementary functions also. So the hypothalamus is having the autonomic effect also. It controls the autonomic nervous system, it mediates the sympathetic activity. Now, the next function of hypothalamus is it's having temperature regulation function. So, there will be a balance between heat production and heat loss in the body. So, there are lots of mechanisms which controls the heat production and which controls the temperature of the body. So, once there is a raised temperature, it causes there will be vasodilatation and sweating. It gives the information for vasodilatation and sweating, and it controls the temperature. So, once there is vasodilatation, there will be the blood will be there will be more movement of the blood and the distribution of the heat at different parts of the body, and the body controls the heat. And next mechanism of heat control is sweating. And once there is a lowered temperature is there, so body itself, especially through mediated by hypothalamus, there will be vasoconstriction and there will be shivering. It also produces heat. So, temperature regulation is especially done by hypothalamus. So, it is by once there is a decrease in the heat, so it makes hypothalamus regulate, and it increase the vasoconstriction and shivering and produces more heat. And along with that, if there is an increased heat, if there is a raised heat, by doing vasodilatation and sweating, it controls or it depresses the heat. Now, next function of hypothalamus is the regulation of food and water intake. That is, there is a feeding center and a satiative center is there in the hypothalamus. The feeding center is situated laterally, and satiative center is situated in the medial side. So, for example, if there is stimulation of the feeding center, it causes hungry. So, the person may take more food. Or if there is a stimulation of satiative center, the person will feel like the person won't feel hungry, and there will be hyperphagia. And there will be hypophagia. If there is stimulation of the satiative center, there will be hypophagia. So, stimulation of the feeding center or the damage of the satiative center causes a hyperphagia, which leads to obesity. Now, if there is stimulation of the satiative center and damage to the feeding center causes hypophagia or even aphasia. So, regulation of the food intake is done by hypothalamus. There is a feeding center and a satiative center. Which center is getting stimulated depends upon that. The person may feel hungry, hyperphagia or aphasia or even hypophagia. Now, there is a drinking center is also situated in the lateral part of the hypothalamus. So, this also controls how much thirst the person is. So, hypothalamus regulate the food and water intake also. So, it is the feeding center is placed on the lateral side of the hypothalamus, and the satiative center is placed on the medial side of the hypothalamus. Again, drinking center is on the lateral part of the hypothalamus. So, that this is the method how this is the regulation of the food and water intake. Now, it is having control on sexual and reproduction activities. So, we already discussed it produces some releasing hormone and inhibiting hormone. So, there is a gonadotropin, it produces gonadotropin releasing hormone, and it controls through anterior pituitary, it controls the gametogenesis, it controls the various reproductive cycles, and it produces maturation and maintenance of secondary sexual characters. Now, another function of hypothalamus is that it controls the biological clock. There is a rhythm in the body, there is a biological clock in the body, and hypothalamus is the center which controls the biological clock. And next is emotion, fear, rage, pleasure, reward, punishment. All these are controlled by hypothalamus along with the limbic system and prefrontal cortex. So we were discussing about the functions of hypothalamus. It produces growth hormone, releasing hormone. It is having an endocrine control that is, it controls the anterior pituitary, producing growth hormone, releasing hormone, thyrotropin releasing hormone, then gonadotropin releasing hormone, somatostatin and prolactin inhibiting hormone. Then it secretes or it produces oxytocin and vasopressin. So it can be considered as the mediator or chief part of the autonomic activity, and it regulates the temperature. It regulates the food and water intake, and it's having an active role in sexual and reproductive activities. It controls the biological clock, and along with the limbic system and prefrontal cortex, it controls the emotion, fear, rage, pleasure, reward, punishment, etc. Now, in case of lesion, any injury or any lesions of the hypothalamus, so it causes obesity. There is chance of obesity, diabetes insipidus, epilepsy, sexual disturbances. There may be disturbance in the sleep or disturbance in the biological clock. There may be chance of hyperglycemia and even glucosuria. So any of the symptoms, depends upon which part is affected or depends upon how much it is affected, any of the symptom may present. So there may be obesity, chance of obesity, diabetes insipidus, epilepsy may be the sexual disturbances, may be the disturbance of sleep, and biological clock may be there. There may be chance of hyperglycemia and glucosuria. Next important structure in the brain is the basal ganglia. Basal ganglia is considered as, it is a subcortical intracerebral mass of gray matter forming an important part of the extrapyramidal system. Basal ganglia is having mainly 4 parts. There is a corpus striatum, there is amygdaloid body, there is a claustrum and caudate. These are the different 4 parts of the basal ganglia. Corpus striatum, amygdaloid body, claustrum and caudate are the 4 different parts of the basal ganglia. Now, what are the functions of basal ganglia? So it is necessary for normal tone and posture, and it is needed for all voluntary and associated movements, and it is associated as its main function is initiation of voluntary movement, and it inhibits the appearance of static tremor. So any lesions of this basal ganglia causes, that is, it will affect the tone and posture, and it will affect the movement, especially the initiation of movement, and it causes trauma, static trauma. So main functions of basal ganglia are, it is necessary for normal degree of tone and posture, and it is needed for voluntary movement, that is starting or especially associated as well, especially initiation of voluntary movement and associated movements, and it inhibits the appearance of static tremor. Now, there may be chance of damage to this basal ganglia, and the damage or lesions of the basal ganglia is known as Parkinsonism or Parkinson's syndrome. The causes may be idiopathic or a Wilson's disease, which is there will be associated liver diseases also. A viral infection of the brain may get affected the basal ganglia, or a direct trauma or a traumatic brain injury. Even there are drug-induced lesions are also there. So the causes may be an idiopathic without any cause, or a Wilson's disease, a viral disease, or a drug-induced basal ganglia lesion, or even a direct trauma may cause the lesions of the basal ganglia. Now, we already discussed that the functions of basal ganglia is mainly, controls the normal degree and tone, and it inhibits the chance of appearance of tremors, and it is one of the main area which controls the proper movement. Now, absence of any lesions of this basal ganglia causes affect all these functions. So the signs and symptoms of Parkinsonism is, the first one is rigidity. Rigidity, the type of rigidity seen in Parkinsonism are lead pipe rigidity and cogwheel type of rigidity. Lead pipe rigidity means that there will be rigidity throughout the movement, and cogwheel rigidity is a jerking type of movement will be available. So there will be rigidity at intervals. Now tremors. There will be the function of basal ganglia is inhibition of tremors. Now the lesions of the basal ganglia can cause tremors. So the tremors is usually resting type of tremors. Resting tremors can be seen. Now hypokinesia or akinesia may be seen. That is, there is decreased movement because basal ganglia is a structure which controls the movement. So especially the voluntary movement. So it causes a decrease in the movement or even difficult to start the movement. Then the muscles may be affected. The muscles, there will be the movements of the muscle will be affected. Even the facial muscles will get affected. It causes an expressionless face, and that is the expressionless face, and the face is known as massus facies. And there will be chance of chorias, and there will be athetosis, and pill rolling tremor may be there. Tremor, the type of tremor is resting tremor or pill rolling type of tremors you can see. And gait also will get affected. The name of the gait is called a fascinating gait. The subjects will walk like he is as if he is going to catch the center of gravity, and there will be short, fast steps will be there. So once we go through the signs and symptoms of Parkinsonism, there will be cogwheel or lead pipe of rigidity, there will be resting tremor, there will be hypokinesia or akinesia, there will be massus facies, and there will be fascinating gait, chorea, and athetosis. These are the major signs and symptoms of Parkinsonism. Next structure is the internal capsule. Internal capsule is a V-shaped structure. It's a large band of fibers situated in the inframedial part of the cerebral hemisphere. Now, internal capsule contains the fibers coming and going out of the cortex. Now, we can compare this internal capsule. There are lots of fibers. It contains lots of fibers going out and coming from the cerebral cortex. So it can be compared as a narrow gate where the fibers are densely crowded. So as almost all the fibers or important fibers passing through this internal capsule, a small damage in the internal capsule can cause a wide spread of dearrangement. So internal capsule is a V-shaped area which contain lots of fibers which going to and coming back from the cerebral cortex. So even a small lesions of the cerebral cortex causes wide spread of dearrangement. Now one of the most important part of the cerebrum, it's the cerebral cortex itself. Now once we see anatomically the cerebral cortex can be divided into 3 areas. There are 4 areas. Anatomically, the cerebral cortex can be divided into 4 areas. That is frontal, parietal, temporal, and occipital lobes. So cerebral cortex can be divided into frontal, parietal, temporal, and occipital lobes. Now, Brodmann have divided the cerebral cortex into 47 areas, different areas for different functions. So some major areas are motor area is area 4. There is a premotor area, that is area 6. There is frontal eye field, area 8. Prefrontal area, that is area 9, 10, 11, 12. There is Broca's area, it's also called speech area, that is area 44. These are some major areas, and we already discussed, that is Brodmann divided the area cerebral cortex into different areas. Then we already discussed how the lobes are, how the cerebrum is divided into different lobes, and the frontal lobe mainly controls the voluntary control of the skeletal muscle is at the frontal lobe. Motivation, aggression, mood is also controlled. Then planning, social judgment, intelligence, everything is controlled by the frontal area. Then parietal area is the major center for reception and evaluation of most of the sensory information, but it excludes smell, hearing, and vision. And it's the taste, touch, pressure, temperature and pain is already the reception and evaluation of most of these sensory information like taste, touch, pressure, temperature and pain is at the parietal lobe. But smell, hearing and vision are not there. That is especially the special senses. 3 important special senses are not there in the parietal lobe. Occipital lobe is the area where it receive and evaluate the vision, and temporal lobe is the area which evaluate the smell and hearing, and then memory and visual recognition and emotions are controlled by the temporal area. So again, the parts that frontal area, mainly the voluntary control of the skeletal muscles and its intelligence, motivation, social judgment, aggression, planning, mood, etc. is controlled by the frontal area. Then parietal area, especially these are the sensory areas, especially it receives the sensation like taste, touch, pressure, temperature, pain, but occipital area is for vision and temporal area is for smell and hearing, especially the memory, visual recognition and emotional behavior is at temporal area. Now there is a small part called insula. Insula is a part of the limbic system. It plays a role in understanding the spoken languages, taste and integrating sensory information from visceral receptors. So motor areas of frontal lobes are the primary motor cortex are the premotor cortex are there, Broca's area is there. So the motor cortex consists of the primary motor cortex. It controls the voluntary contraction of the skeletal muscle and it contains the pyramidal cells, which is the origin of the pyramidal tract. So cerebrum consists of the motor area, especially the frontal lobe consists of the motor areas. It contains the primary motor cortex. It controls especially the voluntary contraction of the skeletal muscle cells, and it contains the pyramidal cells, which is the origin of the pyramidal tract. Then it contains the premotor cortex. It contains especially the extrapyramidal tracts, and its main function is the coordination of the movements in a sequence. And much of the next area is the Broca's area. Broca's area, especially, it controls the speech. Now, cerebrum contains the sensory areas. The main sensory area is primary sensory cortex. It is seen at the parietal lobe. Especially, its main function is it controls the touch, pressure, temperature, and pain. Now, there is a visual cortex is there. It's seen at the occipital lobe. There is an auditory cortex. It is at the temporal lobe. There is a olfactory cortex. It is again seen at the temporal lobe, and there is a gustatory cortex. It is at the insula and frontal lobe. So cerebrum consists of the motor area. Motor area consists of primary motor cortex, premotor cortex, and Broca's area. The sensory area consists of the primary sensory cortex, which is seen at the parietal lobe, visual cortex, which is seen at the occipital lobe, or auditory cortex, which is seen at the temporal lobe, and olfactory cortex also seen at the temporal lobe, and gustatory cortex, it is seen at the insula and frontal lobe. Now, there is another system called the limbic system. Its main function is its emotions. It establishes emotional state. So, it links the consciousness functions of the cerebral cortex with autonomic functions of the brainstem. It facilitates the memory storage and retrieval. It makes you want to do a complex task. Its limbic system can also be called as motivational system. So this session we discussed about the anatomy of the brain. So we'll go through this. We'll go through what are the things we studied already. So we divided the brain into 2 hemispheres. A cerebral and 2 hemispheres, and there is a 2 cerebellar hemispheres are also there, and there is a brainstem. So cerebral part is there. Brain consists of a cerebrum, cerebellum, and brainstem, which contain the midbrain, pons, and medulla. Then cerebrum again we divide into different lobes, and midbrain the brainstem can be divided. We divide into they can be divided into midbrain, pons, and medulla. Then we studied about the cerebellum, its functions of the cerebellum, and its main and what will happen once there is a lesions to the cerebellum. There will be chance of tremors, there will be dysarthria, there will be nystagmus, there will be dysdiadokinesia, and different types of hypotonia, and posture also will get affected. Then thalamus, main function, we studied about the thalamus and its function, hypothalamus and its functions like endocrine control, its secretion, its autonomic effects. It's a center of the autonomous nervous system. We discussed about the temperature regulations of the hypothalamus. Then we discussed about the basal ganglia and how that is injury to the basal ganglia may cause the disease called the syndrome called Parkinson's syndrome, and internal capsule, which is the major part where the fibers are passing through. And we discussed about the cerebral cortex. It can be divided into 4 lobes, and we can divide it into different areas, and we discussed about which are the different motor areas and sensory areas. This session will be discussing about the special senses. Last classes we already discussed about what is sensory impulses and regarding the receptors also. The sensation we can divide the sensation into 2 types of sensation: general sensation and special senses. So senses can be divided into general senses and special senses. Regarding general senses, we already discussed like pain, chemoreception, baroreception, touch, pressure, temperature, etc. We already discussed. So these are the general sensations. So there are some special sensation are there. The special sensation include vision, audition, gestation, and olfaction. Now, which are the receptors? For any senses, there will be the first starting organ or end organ is the receptors. The receptors for vision are the rods and cones seen at the retina. Now, the receptor for audition are the hair cells or organ of cortei seen at the cochlea of the internal ear. Now, the receptor for gestation is gestatory cells of the taste buds of the tongue, and for the receptor for the olfaction is olfactory neurons present at the olfactory epithelium. So there are 4 special senses are there. It include vision, audition, gestation, and olfaction, and there are receptors for all these senses. Now the first one is, we will go through the first special sense and one of the most important special sense, that is vision. So the most important structure in the vision is the eye or eyeball itself. Eyeball, everybody know, it's seen, it is lodged or it is loaded in a bony socket called orbit. Now between this orbit and eyeball, there are some voluntary muscles which causes the movements of the eyeball. There is lacrimal gland which produces tear. Now between the eyeball and orbit, there are voluntary muscles. There is lacrimal gland which produces tears. There are fats and connective tissues are present between this orbit and eyeball. So eyeball is situated, or eyeball is lodged in the orbit. Orbit is the bony socket in the head region. Now between the orbit and eyeball, there are muscles are there are lacrimal glands are there are fats and connective tissues are there. So there are voluntary muscles. I already told you, voluntary muscles are supplied by the cranial nerves, and it is the 3rd, 4th and 6th cranial nerve supplies the voluntary muscles of around the eyeball. So we'll go through it later. Now, eyeball. Once we go through the anatomy of cross section of the eyeball can be divided. Eye is having three cords: an outer cord which consists of sclera and cornea, and middle cord, it is also called the vascular cord, and an inner cord which contain especially the retina. So, eye is having three cords: an anterior cord or an outer cord, a middle cord, and an inner cord. The outer cord or anterior part of the outer cord, the anterior part of the outer cord is called cornea, and the rest part is called sclera. It is the visible part which is seen from outside the outside. So, the anterior part of the outer cord is called cornea, and the rest is called sclera. Now, cornea is absolutely transparent, and it does not have any vascular supply, and there is no blood supply. So, its nutrition comes from, or its oxygen supply comes from atmosphere and also from the aqueous humor. The second cord or middle cord is the vascular cord. It's having again three parts. There is an iris part called iris. It's seen at the anteriorly and choroid posteriorly. Between iris and choroid, there are ciliary bodies are present. Then center of the iris is called pupil. Center of the iris forms the pupil, and iris is situated in front of the lens, and the area between the iris and lens is called posterior chamber. You can see all these structures in the picture. Now, iris contains two sets of smooth muscles. These are constrictor pupillae and restrictor pupillae. Now, there are ciliary body is present, and it is highly vascular. There are suspensory ligaments are also present. It is attached to the these ligaments attaches lens to the ciliary body, and ciliary body also contains some smooth muscles. Now, the contraction of the smooth muscle causes the relaxation of the suspensory ligaments, causes bulging of the anterior surface of the lens. Now, the innermost layer is called retina. It is extend up to the anteriorly, it is extend up to the ciliary body, and retina is the innermost part of the eye. Now, the optic nerve, which is the nerve of the eye or nerve of vision, is optic nerve arises from the posterior pole of the eye, and retina is considered as, we can consider, or it is considered as an extension of the cerebrum or extension of brain. Now, there are two types of organ. We already discussed which are the receptors of the vision. These are rods and cones, and there are two types of these rods and cones are present at the retina. There are two types of end organs or receptors are present in the retina. These are rods and cones. Now, there are some difference between the rods and cones. Cones are for bright vision, and rods for dim light. So, cones are required for bright vision, and rods are required for vision at dim light. Now, retina is having several layers. The layers include layers of the pigmental from superior to the inferior, or from outer to inner. There is layer of pigmental cells. There is layer of receptors or layer of rods and cones. External limiting membrane is there. Then there is external nuclear layer is there. Then external plexiform layer is there. Then inner nuclear layer is there. Internal plexiform layer is there. There is layer of ganglionic cells are there. Then the layer of optic nerve fiber is there, and there is an inner limiting layer or inner limiting membrane is there. These are the layers of retina. Now, once you are seeing an object, the image of the object through the lens, it falls on the retina. Now, once the image falls on the retina, it stimulates the rods and cones. These are the receptors we already discussed. These are the receptors seen at the retina. It causes the stimulation of the rods and cones. It causes the stimulation of the receptors, and receptors of the retina causing the photochemical changes. Now, because of these photochemical changes, there is chance of development of a potential, action potential, development of impulses and these impulses are transmitted through the synapses to the optic nerve, which is seen at the posterior part of the eyeball. Then this optic nerve carry impulses to the brain and then the subject sees. This is the mechanism of vision. So, as the light strikes on the rods and cones or the the photoreceptors get stimulated, and there is development of electrical signal, and it conveys to the bipolar cells. First of all, as through the lens, the image strikes on the retina, and there will be stimulation of the photoreceptors, or there will be stimulation of the receptors like rods and cones. So, because of this stimulation, there is development of an electrical potential or electrical signal, and this is transferred to the bipolar cells and then to the ganglionic cells. Now, this axon of the ganglionic cells are collected together to make a bundle, and this bundle exits from the eyes as optic nerve posteriorly. Now, the beginning of the optic nerve in the retina is called optic disc. So, the connection between the optic nerve and retina, that beginning is called optic disc, and at this point there is no rods and cones are present. So, this optic disc area is considered as blind spot. Now, there is from the retina the optic nerve starts. Now, optic nerve passes posteriorly and it deposits at optic chiasma. At the deposition of the optic nerve, the fibers from the nasal half of the retina crosses the opposite side, and those of the temporal half does not cross. So, there are two fibers can be seen of the optic nerve, the fibers from the nasal half and the fibers from the temporal half. So, the fibers from the temporal half does not cross, but the fibers from the nasal half crosses at the deposits. After this deposition, the remaining part is called optic tract. So, now each optic tract consists of fibers from nasal half of the opposite, because at deposition there is crossing of the nasal fibers. So, each optic tract consists of fibers from the nasal half of the opposite side and fibers from the temporal half of the same side. For right optic tract consists of fibers from the left nasal half, and fibers from the right temporal area. So, like that, it is mainly because of the crossing of the fibers, crossing of the nasal fibers at the optic deposition. Now, once it forms, after optic deposition, optic nerve will be called as optic tract, because it contain actually two types of fibers: the fibers from opposite nasal half and the same temporal side. Now, the optic tract fibers goes more posteriorly and ends at different places. The major place is the lateral geniculate body. So, this fibers ends at the lateral geniculate body, pretectal area, superior colliculus, suprachiasmatic nucleus of the hypothalamus, pulvinar of the hypothalamus, and other areas of thalamus and brainstem. So, at different areas like lateral geniculate body, pretectal area, so all this optic tract ends at these areas. Mainly, most important fibers from the optic tracts ends at the lateral geniculate body, and it proceeds from there as optic radiation. So, from this optic tract terminate at the lateral geniculate body, and from there it proceeds as optic radiation, and it terminate at the visual cortex or area 17. So, it terminates at the visual cortex or area 17, and the person sees the things. So, this is the exact mechanism of vision. So, we were discussing about the mechanism of vision. The next important special sense is the hearing. So, again, for the hearing, the important organ is the ear itself. Ear can be divided into, once we go through the anatomy of ear can be divided into three parts or three cavities. there is an external ear which is seen outside, which is visible. There is a middle ear which contains especially small bones, and there is an internal ear. There is an internal ear which consists of cochlea. External ear, this is the outer part of the ear. It contains external auditory canal, and the 8 ends at external ear ends at tympanic membrane, and tympanic membrane is the origin, or it is the starting of the middle ear. Now the middle ear consists of especially bones. There are some small bones, and these are malleus, incus, and stapes. Stapes is the smallest bone of the body, and it also contains 2 muscles. These are tensor tympani and stapedius. So that was the middle ear, which consists of 3 bones and 2 muscles. So the major part of the internal ear is cochlea. Now cochlea can be divided into 3 cavities by the presence of 2 membranes, that is retinas membrane and basilar membrane divide the cochlea into 3 cavities. These are scala vestibuli, scala media, and scala tympani. So internal ear can be divided into 3 cavities by the presence of 2 membranes. The cavities are scala vestibuli, scala media, and scala tympani. Now all these cavities contain a fluid called perilymph and endolymph. And there is a basilar membrane and retinas membrane. These are the membrane which divide the internal ear into different cavities. And there is over the basilar membrane there is a structure called organ of Corti present at the basilar membrane, and 1 organ of Corti can be seen in each ear. Now there are special cells called hair cells are present in the organ of Corti, and these are actually the receptors of the hearing. Now from the bottom of each individual hair cells there is starting of the nerves or dendrons, or from each individual hair cells there is emergence of fine nerve tips, which are the dendrons of the neurons which constitute the 8th nerve. So this is the emergence of the nerves actually from the receptors. So internal ear can be divided into 3 cavities by 2 membranes. The membranes are basilar membrane and retinas membrane, and inside the cochlea there are fluids called perilymph and endolymph, and the basilar membrane contain a structure called organ of Corti, which contain hair cells which are the receptors of the hearing, and from the receptors there is starting of the nerve of especially the dendrons of the 8th nerve. Now how we are hearing? What is the mechanism of hearing? Now we already discussed that there is an external ear, and once there is any sound, when sound waves travels it travels through the air. Air is the medium of the sound waves. It travels through the air, and through the external ear it strikes over the tympanic membrane. As it strikes over the tympanic membrane, it causes vibration of the tympanic membrane. Inside the tympanic membrane or at the middle ear, we already discussed that there are bones are present, small bones are present, malleus, incus, and stapes. So this vibration of the tympanic membrane causes vibration of these bones. The vibration will be transmitted to these small bones, and it through the middle ear to the foot plates of the stapes bone. Now this again, the stapes also now starts its movement or begins the vibration, and because of this causes vibration of the internal ear, and it causes the movement of the perilymph. Now because of this movement of the perilymph, there is pressure changes in the perilymph. Now pressure changes this pressure changes in the perilymph causes movement of the endolymph. Now because of the movement of the endolymph, there is movement in the basilar membrane. Now we already discussed that basilar membrane contain hair cells, and the basilar membrane contain hair cells, that is basilar membrane contain organ of Corti which contain hair cells. Now because of this movement of the endolymph, there is movement of the basilar membrane. This causes sideways movement of these hair cells or the receptors. Now, because this causes a change in the electrical impulse, there is chance of there is formation of the impulses, and there is stimulation of these nerve fibers, and there is transmission of the impulses. Now, the nerve cell bodies of the dendrites, all these dendrites constitute the spiral ganglia, and axon arising from the spiral ganglia transmitted to the dorsal and ventral cochlear nuclei. From the cochlear nuclei, the second order neuron arise and relay to the trapezoid body, and from the trapezoid body, further order neuron arise and terminate at the inferior colliculus. And from inferior colliculus, another neuron arise and terminates in the medial geniculate body of the thalamus. And from the medial geniculate body, the final order neuron arise and terminate at the area 44. And we can, from like this is the mechanism of vision, mechanism of hearing. So we already discussed the different parts of the ear and what is the mechanism of hearing. And if any damage to any of the part, this causes deafness. Deafness may be a conductive deafness, mainly because of any damage to the outer part, that is internal ear, external ear or middle ear, or any nerve deafness, that is any damage or lesions to the pathway of the hearing. So this causes deafness. The next special sense we are going to discuss is the smell or olfaction. Now, again, there is an olfactory area, that is the receptors. Olfactory area is present. It is present at the nasal mucosa, and this is the fundamental area of smell. Now, the molecules, once there is a smell, the molecule emanating from the odorant substance, the substance, are carried by the air. Now it reaches the olfactory area or in the nasal mucosa and get dissolved and get dissolved in the mucus. Now, as it dissolved in the mucus, it comes in contact with the intramembranous particle contained with the cilia of the receptor cells and combined with these particles. Now, it causes there is development of receptor potential or the development of an impulses and development of impulses in the axon emerging from the receptor cells. So there will be development of receptor potential, and there will be development of the impulses at the receptor cells. And it is the impulses transferred through the nerve and impulses reach the brain, which we can perceive, smell, and this is the mechanism of olfaction. And the next sensation, special sense, is the gustation or taste sensation. Now, for taste sensation, the receptors are present at the taste buds of the dorsum of the tongue. Now, there are two types of two anterior 2/3 and posterior 1/3. The nerves are also different. The taste sensation from anterior 2/3 of the tongue is carried by cauda tympani nerve, and then proceed the sensory divisions of the 7th cranial nerve and terminates at the nucleus of tractus solitarius. That is, the taste sensation from the anterior 2/3 of the tongue. There are receptors at the tongue, and the taste sensation from the anterior 2/3 of the tongue is carried by the cauda tympani nerve. Then from cauda tympanic nerve, it proceeds to it is passed through the sensory division of the 7th cranial nerve or facial nerve, and then it goes and terminates at the nucleus of tractus solitarius. At the same time, the posterior one-third, the taste sensation from the posterior one-third of the taste sensation is conveyed by the sensory fibers of the glossopharyngeal nerve. It is transferred through glossopharyngeal nerve, and again it also terminates at the tractus solitarius. So there are receptors present at the taste buds, but the nerves which passes the information is two different nerves are there: anterior two-third through chorda tympani and to the facial nerve, and the posterior one-third through glossopharyngeal, and it also terminates at the tractus solitarius. So this is the mechanism of gestation or taste sensation. So we were discussing about the different special senses in this chapter. So we already discussed that there are four special senses are there. These are vision, audition, gustation, and olfaction. Then we discussed about the different receptors of the special senses: vision, rods and cones for vision, hair cells or organ of corte for audition, olfactory cells of the taste bud for gustation, and olfactory neuron present in the olfactory epithelium for olfaction. Vision, we discussed about what is the anatomy of the eye, anatomy of the eyeball, which contain the three cords: an outer cord, middle cord, and inner cord. And we discussed about the how the light or how the vision occurs, the mechanism of vision occurs. Light strikes on the rods and cones, and simulation of these photoreceptors and production of or development of electrical signal, which is transferred to the bipolar cells, then to the ganglionic cells. Then ganglionic cell collect a bundle and exit from the eye as optic nerve. Optic nerve deposits at optic chiasma, and there is crossing of the fibers of the nasal side. There is crossing of the fibers, and there is formation of two optic tracts. Optic tracts goes behind, and it terminates at the lateral geniculate body, and from lateral geniculate body it proceeds as optic radiation and terminates at the visual cortex or area 17. At the same time, hearing, we already discussed its anatomy. It's having three cavities: external, outside, up to the tympanic membrane, then a middle ear, which contain especially bones like malleus, incus, and stapes, and the internal ear, which contain cochlea and which contain fluids called perilymph and endolymph, and the internal ear also contain the organ of corte, which are the receptors or hair cells or organ of corte, which are the receptors for hearing. And mechanism of hearing is that once this vibration passes through the external ear and it reaches the tympanic membrane, causes the vibration of the tympanic membrane. Vibration of the tympanic membrane causes the vibration of the bones in the middle ear, and vibration of the bones causes the vibration movements in the perilymph of the internal vibration of the perilymph, and along with that perilymph and movement of the endolymph also. Then the movement of the endolymph causes the movement at the basilar membrane where the receptors are present, and this vibration or movement causes stimulation of the nerve fibers or organ of corte, and there is stimulation of the nerve fibers and transmission of the impulses through the dendrites, and then it goes to the dorsal and ventricular nuclei, and from the nuclei there is starting of the second order neuron and relate to the trapezoid body. From trapezoid body there is another order, the further order neuron, which arises and terminates at the inferior colliculus. From the inferior colliculus it terminates at the medial geniculate body of the thalamus. From medial geniculate body it terminates at the area 41, and we can hear the sound. Now once we discussed about the olfaction, there is olfactory mucosa get dissolved in then the odor and substance, the molecules of the odor and substance get dissolved in the olfactory mucosa. And it comes in contact with the intramucous particle contained within the cilia of the receptor cells and combine this particle and there is development of receptor potential, development of impulses. It causes development of impulses in the axon emerging from these receptors. The impulses reaches the brain, and we can smell now. And the taste sensation, there are taste buds. The receptors are present at the taste buds, and it passed through two different nerves. The anterior two-thirds of the tongue, taste sensation is passed through the chorda tympani, and then it is transferred through the sensory division of the 7th cranial nerve, that is the facial nerve, and terminates at the tactus solitarius. And at the same time, the posterior one-third of the sensation from the posterior one-third of the tongue is passed through the glossopharyngeal nerve, and it also terminates at the nuclei of tractus solitarius.